So clearly Rocky Linux was a scratch your own itch and very much an independent individual kind of effort. I'm curious, when you created CAOS, what was the itch? Debian existed at the time, and as you mentioned, Slackware as well. So what was the itch? Why did you create CAOS?
So at the end of the 90s, I worked for a company called Linux Care. And Linux Care was the first real Linux company that I had a chance to work with, a company focused on Linux. And what I learned from that was, well, first off, I learned I really loved Debian. And Debian was my go-to operating system as a result of that. How the community worked together, how the maintainers worked together, everything about it, I just really loved and appreciated. So when I got a job at Department of Energy in 2000, I come to realize that they have already standardized on Red Hat as their primary operating system. And when I dug a little deeper, it wasn't that they standardized on Red Hat. They standardized on the look and feel of Red Hat as an operating system. They standardized on RPM. They standardized on that file hierarchy, that mechanism of how to maintain a system. And it's fairly different from Debian, and all the Linux distributions are kind of different in this way. So when I started, using Red Hat and the supported operating systems, it became clear to me that really what I missed the most was the community. And CAOS was a goal to try to fix that, try to create an RPM distribution of Linux that was community-based. And this is well before Fedora existed. So the only things that really, at that point, that were RPM-based, everything was commercial, nothing community. There was, of course, Red Hat. There was Mandrake. It wasn't even Mandriva at the point. It was Mandrake. There was Corel Linux. Corel Linux might have been based on Debian. I'm actually having a hard time remembering now, but there was SUSE, but everything was commercially kind of run. And I'm like, I want the community to do this. I want to do this as part of, community effort. And CAOS Linux was built and designed to kind of fill that gap. Created some goals, some vision statements. Started building some code and some infrastructure. Had a channel on IRC. People would randomly join channels and just like, what are you doing here? Oh, I know somebody who might be interested in that, and they would go get that person. And next thing I know is there was a few other people that were associated with the channel. Some of them had other connections that did stuff like this. And the next thing we know, it just started growing. And CAOS Linux started to be born, started to build out. So we approached the operating system also a little bit differently. And this is probably something worth noting, is we wanted to have the stability of Debian, but we also wanted to have packages that moved a lot faster than Debian. And so we bisected the operating system from a core. We had the CAOS core, and then we had the CAOS extra operating system, which stood on top of the core. And the core was a self-hosting build root, which allowed us to focus on kind of the initial core absolute stable packages. And then everything that rides on top of this build root is free to move a lot more freely. So your window manager, for example, what web browser you're using, those can all move very freely on top of this very stable core. We felt as though it gave us the best of all worlds. So we built this operating system and got a lot of support for it. And then
I was actually around at HP at that time. And part of my job was I was responsible for the distribution strategy for Linux for HP. And at the time, I had Red Hat and SUSE in the server space. I had Red Hat and Mandrake at the workstation space. And I had Red Hat and Monte Vista in the embedded space because I wanted competition for Red Hat because they were spanning all three at the time. And that seemed to make sense. But of course, all of our Linux developers were dedicated Debian users. Yeah, right. And BDL Garby was part of that team, right? And so he was obviously one of the leaders in Debian as well, and project leader at that time. But yeah, that and you mentioned the conferences. I started doing those conferences in 2001, so they were already rather big. And HP was one of those big names that was going. And, we had IDG conference in January in New York, and we had the other big conference out. I think that was also still IDG back in San Francisco, and those ran for several years. But yeah, that was a great eclectic collection, right, of corporate folk meeting the open source community. And it was really helpful to take corporate people to those events because they had no clue what the value was, what the momentum was, and those events. And to this day, taking corporate types to events is one of the best ways to educate them as to what open source really does and is capable of.